All right, look. I need you to stay with me here because what I'm about to show you is genuinely insane. For the first time in over 170 years, an American president looked at our longest undefended border, looked at our closest ally, and basically said, "We don't need you. You need us. We're fine without you." Those weren't my words. That's a direct quote from President Trump. And he didn't just say it once and move on. He's been repeating it, building this whole narrative that Canada should just become our 51st state, because apparently, they need us way more than we need them. But here's where this gets absolutely wild. That statement might be the most economically illiterate thing any American president has ever said on the world stage. And I'm not being dramatic. I'm going to prove it to you with numbers so clear, so undeniable, that you'll see exactly why this matters to every single one of us. Let's start with energy, because this is where the whole "we don't need Canada" argument falls apart immediately. Every single day, not sometimes, not occasionally, every single day, 4.1 million barrels of Canadian oil cross into the United States. That's more than we import from any other country on Earth. In 2024, Canada supplied 63% of all our crude oil imports. 63%. That's nearly 2/3 of every barrel of foreign oil going into American refineries. Now here's the part nobody's talking about. Our refineries, especially the massive ones down on the Gulf Coast, they're not built to run on just any oil. They're specifically designed to process heavy crude, that thick sulfur-rich stuff that comes from Alberta's oil sands. This isn't about preference. These refineries were built over decades with billions in infrastructure specifically to handle this exact type of oil. So when Trump says we don't need Canada, he's basically saying we can replace 4 million barrels a day of heavy crude overnight. From where exactly? Venezuela's production has collapsed. Mexico's declining year after year. The Middle East? Sure, technically possible, but you're talking about completely rebuilding supply chains, reconfiguring refinery operations, and oh yeah, depending on a region where stability is measured in weeks, not centuries. But wait, it gets worse. Canada supplies 98% of our natural gas imports. 98%. When you heat your house this winter, when power plants generate electricity to keep your lights on, that energy is flowing through Canadian pipelines. And there's no backup plan. These are decades of infrastructure investments you can't just replace with a phone call. And electricity? Canada provides 82% of all the electricity we import. States like New York, Michigan, Minnesota, they're not just buying Canadian power as a nice supplement. They're depending on it to keep the grid stable and prevent blackouts. Let me put a number on this. The entire energy relationship between the US and Canada was worth $151 billion in 2024. That's not Canada exploiting us. That's American businesses, American utilities, and American consumers choosing Canadian energy because it's reliable, it's close, and it's exactly what our infrastructure needs. So when Trump says we don't need Canada, what he's really saying is, we don't need 63% of our oil imports, we don't need 98% of our natural gas imports, and we don't need 82% of our electricity imports. Which is just another way of saying we don't need functioning refineries, heated homes, or stable power grids. But energy is just the beginning. Canada was our #1 export destination in 2024. Not second, not top 5, #1. We exported $350 billion worth of goods to Canada last year. Meanwhile, we imported $413 billion from them. That's about a $62 billion trade deficit in goods. Now, Trump loves talking about trade deficits like they're proof we're getting ripped off. But here's what that completely misses. About half the trade between us and Canada isn't even finished products. It's components, raw materials, parts that cross the border multiple times during production. Take cars. When a Chevy Silverado rolls off an assembly line in Michigan, parts in that truck have crossed the US-Canada border several times during production. Steel from Ontario gets shipped to Ohio to be formed into parts. Those parts go back to Canada for processing. Then they return for final assembly. That's not exploitation. That's two economies so intertwined you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. And we're already seeing what happens when you mess with this. The tariffs Trump imposed in early 2025 hit like an earthquake. By April, Canadian exports to us had crashed 26% from January. That's not an adjustment. That's a collapse. But here's what American media isn't covering enough. Those tariffs didn't just hurt Canada. Our imports overall fell 20% in April 2025, the biggest single-month drop since the 2009 financial crisis, excluding the pandemic. Why? Because when you slap 25% tariffs on half your imports, businesses can't magically find domestic replacements overnight. American manufacturers suddenly paying 25% more for Canadian steel didn't celebrate. They absorbed the cost, crushed their margins, and quietly started planning layoffs. And consumers? You haven't felt it fully yet, but you will. Inflation that was finally cooling is ticking back up. The Fed's watching nervously. Economists are calling this a self-inflicted wound. But the economic damage isn't even the scariest part. For the first time in modern history, a Canadian Prime Minister stood up and said, "Canadians are living in dark days brought on by a country we can no longer trust. That country is the United States. Not Russia, not China. The United States of America." Trump hasn't just threatened tariffs. He's repeatedly called for Canada to be annexed as our 51st state. He suggested using economic force to make it happen. He's mocked their leaders, questioned their sovereignty, and treated the whole country like it's a property in one of his real estate deals. The reaction? According to 2025 polling, 90% of Canadians oppose annexation. 90%. Another poll found 82% would rather become part of the British Empire again than join the United States. Think about that. Canadians who spent decades building their own identity separate from Britain would rather go back than join us under these circumstances. Canadian nationalism has exploded. There's been a massive surge in Buy Canadian campaigns. Canadians are actively avoiding American products. Canadian trips to the U.S. are down 31% year over year, not because of gas prices, but because Canadians are choosing not to spend money in a country whose president treats them with contempt. Canada's hit back with retaliatory tariffs on $30 billion of U.S. goods, with another $125 billion targeted if this escalates. Canadian provinces have even threatened to cut electricity to certain U.S. states. Ontario floated cutting power to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. They backed off, but the fact it was even discussed shows how far this has fallen. And here's what's genuinely alarming. International observers are drawing comparisons they've never drawn before. Trump's statements about Canada are being compared to Putin's rhetoric about Ukraine before the invasion. Xi Jinping's language about Taiwan, the idea that a neighboring country isn't really independent, that its sovereignty is conditional. NATO allies are watching with growing alarm. If we're willing to economically coerce Canada, our longest-standing ally, what does that say about American commitments to smaller nations that depend on our security guarantees? So let's test this claim seriously. America doesn't need Canada. Imagine Canada stopped exporting energy tomorrow. Refineries scrambling to find 4 million barrels a day of heavy crude from somewhere. Gasoline prices spiking. Heating costs soaring. Imagine they stopped exporting natural gas. Midwest homes freezing in winter. Northeast power plants scrambling for alternatives. Rolling blackouts becoming not just possible, but probable. These aren't doomsday scenarios I'm making up. This is what "we don't need Canada" actually means when you follow the logic. And here's the deeper question. What happens when you convince yourself you don't need something you actually depend on? History's full of examples, and they're never pretty. The early results aren't encouraging. Canada's economy contracted in Q2 2025 because of our tariffs. But our economy is slowing too. The Commerce Department reported contraction in early 2025. Consumer confidence is falling. Business investment is declining. And this is before the 2026 USMCA review, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA. It's up for review next year, and Trump's made clear he's willing to walk away entirely. If that happens, economists predict a full recession in Canada and major damage here. Worst case? Canada's GDP could shrink 2.6%, about $78 billion Canadian. Meanwhile, our economy would shrink 1.6%, about $467 billion. Americans would effectively pay $1,300 per person per year for the privilege of economically punishing Canada. For what? Trump claims it's about border security, about fentanyl, and undocumented migrants. But the data shows those problems come from elsewhere. Canada isn't the source of our fentanyl crisis. That's coming from China through Mexico or being made domestically. Illegal crossings from Canada are minimal. In fact, recently, there have been more Americans illegally entering Canada than the reverse. So what's really driving this? Some think it's transactional. Trump thinks he can bully Canada into concessions. Others think it's performative, red meat for his base. Some worry it's darker, a genuine belief that American power should dominate rather than build alliances. Whatever the reason, the consequences are real and accelerating. Canadian businesses are diversifying away from us as fast as they can. Every supply chain reconfigured, every investment that goes elsewhere. That's capacity we won't get back easily. And it's not just Canada watching. Mexico, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia. Every American ally is doing the same calculation. If we'll treat Canada this way, what happens to them? That's the real cost of we don't need Canada, not the trade deficit, not even the immediate economic damage. It's the long-term erosion of American influence. Allies deciding they can't depend on us anymore. Because trust takes decades to build and moments to shatter. And once it's gone, you can't tweet your way back into being a reliable partner. So where does this end? Maybe Trump backs down and declares victory. Maybe we stumble into a crisis that forces de-escalation. Maybe the 2026 review becomes a reset instead of a breaking point. But here's what I know. Every day this continues, the damage compounds. Supply chains built over decades get dismantled in months. Relationships that weathered wars crumble over trade disputes that shouldn't exist. When historians look back, they'll point to three words: we don't rely on Canada. Because mathematics doesn't care what you believe. The 4 million barrels a day, the 98% of natural gas, the 82% of electricity, the $350 billion in exports. These numbers don't change because a president declares them irrelevant. Reality always wins. If this opened your eyes to what's really happening, smash that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that actually matter. And drop a comment. Can the US-Canada relationship recover from this? Or are we watching something fundamental break in real time? Let me know what you think.